Hey folks, it's Chris with the Human Project Podcast. This episode I'm really excited about because it's diving into one of our favorite topics, and that is abiding in what God has called us to be. The danger that we have is the tendency to think that principles and practices and just doing stuff and going off of this checklist is what gives us our right standing. And that's not the case at all. So in this episode, we're going to dive into what does God actually call us into, and how do we balance these things and hold these things in tension so that we can experience the abundant life that God promised for us. Take a listen. Let us know what you think. Hello, Mark.
Hey there, Chris.
How's it going?
It is really good today. How about you?
I am also doing really good.
Excellent.
Living life.
Living life.
Yes.
That's a good thing.
Living life.
It's better than the alternatives.
Dying death.
Yeah. Both things are at work in our bodies at the same time.
Oh, yeah. There you go. You're going to go 2 Corinthians 4 on us. But this principle of living, I think, is a really interesting one. You added this to our talk about list of our tendency to live by principles and practices.
Right.
And I think even our phrase, like to blank is human, the curiosity behind that is, what does God mean with that? Right. It's really easy to fill that with a checklist. Mm-hmm. So why was this on your agenda? What brought this to mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's tension. Neither thing is the thing.
Neither principles nor
practices, nor what I would propose as kind of a balancing factor or alternative to it of abiding is the thing. And it's just a really rich and difficult spot to be in. But I think it's a lot easier. I think our minds are set up to try and figure out the rules so that we can just follow those. And I think we have tremendous evidence going back even into what I call the First Testament, what we commonly call the Old Testament. You got the 613 commandments, right?
The Shema? Is that what it was called?
No.
Oh, just kidding.
No. I think you're mixing up Shema and Tanakh.
I'm getting overconfident since since I had 2 Corinthians 4, 7 through 12, right?
But like what was a tendency then would be to follow the rules because they're the rules and miss out on what's the factor, what's the reason God gave them, and how does he want us to walk with them instead of making them the thing. Yeah. And I just was challenged by that recently and then thought about, again, like you're saying, how we handle things in our classes when we're teaching Human Project or EMI classes, how we talk about things in our podcast. And I go, I think sometimes we might be unbalanced in that as well, that it's very satisfying to come up to realize a principle that is helpful in life. Yeah. Some things help us in some very godly ways. Other things are, other principles or practices are going to help us live, help our bodies be healthy, those kind of things. Yeah. But they're not the thing by themselves. And I think sometimes we may have landed in a spot or in a note in our classes and our podcasts that kind of just leaves it there. And I think the biggest challenge for me came when I was talking to Pastor Jamie. Oh,
well, let me pause you before you go there. Just to help illustrate, I think it'd be helpful for us to walk through what are some of these principles or practices, just to help wrap our minds around that.
Right.
So I think of practices, things that come to mind are things like spiritual disciplines, like fasting, prayer, spending time in the Word, community worship, right? Things like that. Is that what you mean by practices?
Even community, be connected with other people. You can get down into some specific practices that we're very passionate about, things like reflective, empathetic listening, setting boundaries. The list can go on and on. And again, I'm not arguing with the practices or the principles per se. I'm just wondering if maybe we're unbalanced in how we're approaching them in general.
And by that, you mean it's easy for those to become the thing.
Yes.
Like as long as we're doing this list of practices, God and I are good.
Exactly. I'm having my quiet time every day and it includes this and that and the other thing. Yeah. Therefore, I'm good. Or I'm memorizing scripture, so therefore I'm good to go. Okay. Or I'm reflectively listening to the people around me, therefore I have good relationships, and that's what God wants, is reflective listening.
So going back to like our scorecard episode, changing the scorecard to I'm doing these things, so everything is going well. Thank you. That helps. That helps clarify it a lot for me.
And if we take it to, because of course, what would be good to do is to go look at what Jesus did in this as well. For example, in John 5 and several other places in the other Gospels, Jesus breaks the Sabbath. The way that the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the time were interpreting what it meant to follow Shabbat,
Yep.
right? To hold that as sacred, because that is clearly important. It's one of the 10 commandments.
Right.
Not arguing at all with, again, the principle or in general practice of Shabbat, but Jesus did something that broke their interpretation of the rules.
Yeah.
That's worth pausing and going, what
Yep.
just happened there? He didn't throw the Sabbath out.
Record scratch.
Yeah, exactly. He didn't throw the Sabbath out, but there was something else at play here.
Yeah.
And I think one of the biggest challenge moments for me on this came with our reflective listening skill that we teach and practice so often, where I was talking to Pastor Jamie from Marymount Church because we're in this sermon series with him. And coming soon, we'll be talking about how to do community with him. And so we were talking about what that would look like, how we could help people to do community well with Jesus.
Yeah.
And of course, I offer reflective listening, because that is a great skill that can help with that.
Yeah.
And one of Jamie's reflections or challenges was that's, as very good skill, but you don't need Jesus to do that. You can just do that. Like people do that without God all the time. Maybe not all the time, but people do that without God and do it effectively. You can empathetically listen without God.
Sure.
So what's the difference in doing that with God? And that really challenged me a lot. Again, not to throw out the practice, but to say, wait a minute, how do we handle this in a way that's really what God intends for us to be doing?
Yeah. Yeah. And the principle could be, so the practice is, sounds like you're feeling blank about blank. Boom. That's the bottom line of reflective, simple listening. You can do that really well, really poorly. The principle would be like, I want to show care. I want to be connected. I want to love this person. And even that you can do for an end in of itself.
Yeah.
So you're talking using these principles and practices not as the end in themselves, but what are they revealing more about what God is calling us to?
Or even when does God want me to use the practices or apply the principles? Because I don't think, if we look in John 5, that Jesus was saying throw out I know he wasn't saying throw out the Sabbath, or even the way that the Pharisees were interpreting it. I don't know necessarily Jesus would say never do that.
Yeah.
Like if we look at his response, I think it's very instructive. And I want to read it so that I don't misquote Jesus. That's not a good practice. But they're challenging him, and Jesus says, my Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working. So the word work here is direct opposite of Sabbath, right?
Yep.
So that seems very contradictory. God rested on the seventh day. Jesus said, my Father is always working. So he's challenging something very deep underneath this. And the very next section right after this, and what we have as a next paragraph, he says, truly I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He's dependent on the Father. Even Jesus was dependent on the Father, could do nothing by himself. And then he follows that up with, he can do only what he sees his Father doing. So he's doing what he sees Daddy doing. So he's that tuned into his Father to see what his Father's up to, both in a principal way, but also very specific ways. In this moment, his Father was doing work, bringing healing on the Sabbath. And so he said, I'm all in. It's almost like reprioritizing based on what God is doing at that moment.
Yeah.
That requires a lot of relational connection with the Father in order to be able to say in this moment, yes, there's this principle of reflective listening, if we take it back to our typical example. But in this moment, what's God up to? Does he want me to confront? Does he want me to challenge? What is he doing? And then that's what I'm going to be doing. Again, not to toss reflective listening out, but instead to challenge ourselves. What's Daddy up to?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way of looking at it. And my first gut reaction to that is, ooh, but how does that look?
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly what it's intended to be.
Yes.
Is we tend to fall in love with this comfort. And I think that's why like the checklist, the practices, the principles, like as long as we're doing those things, like, cool, I'm good, I've got this. It's self-dependent.
Right.
Is what it is. It's up to me to do this. And we can talk all about the beauties of grace and the beauties of mercy and what God has done in us and is continuing to do in us. Like, yes, that's the gospel lived out. But what I think we need to be okay with is living in that uncomfortability. I was talking to Mark Jones about this yesterday. like I said, we had a wonderful conversation. And one of the things that I brought up was parenting. Like the last week has been really, really challenging. We've had some wonderful, absolutely beautiful moments, like watching Sophia sing "Open the Eyes of My Heart," Lord of all things. But then like there was a day that it was just like, I felt like she didn't listen to anything we said. And it was really discouraging, not because of just the day, but it felt like, oh, well, we were making progress.
Okay.
And like we expect progress to be completely linear.
Yeah.
Never step back. Like, oh, I thought we had this settled. And the same thing is true for like planning in the future. Like, what do we want to be doing for jobs, for the investments that we're making, for the projects that we're taking on? Like, we want to have confidence, make a decision now, and don't have to worry about it again.
Right.
There's all this sense of comfort that comes into play with all of these. And what I hear behind what you're saying is like, lose that sense of comfort in that. Lose the sense of comfort in the practices and the principles, and find the comfort in who we are abiding with, who we are partnering with, who we're walking side by side with. We mentioned this back at the Christianese episode of Opening Doors. Like, find your comfort in walking with him.
Yeah.
And that might be different. And that's not going to just be a black and white answer, but it's this process of abiding and being in relationship constantly.
Right.
Being tethered to.
Yeah. This, I think, is maturity as believers. So please, if you're listening and you're just learning some of the spiritual disciplines, I don't think that's bad at all.
Right.
Right. When we are learning something new, we need the training wheels. Absolutely. So if you're learning reflective listening, follow the formula. Absolutely. That is not bad. That's how you're going to learn it and internalize it to the point where you will then, in the midst of doing that, be able to relationally listen to God and say, God, what is this person feeling? Oh, do you want me to reflectively listen to them right now? That's the only way to get there.
Yeah. Same thing is true with other spiritual disciplines, like spending time in the Word.
Yes.
Like, don't think like, oh, I don't have to spend time in the Word because I'm connecting with God. That's literally how you connect with God, but maybe that's not a good example. But like these spiritual disciplines are not the end in of themselves.
Yeah.
They are intended to help tether you to the end in of himself.
Yes. Well said. Definitely. And so I think it is part of our maturing as believers to continually be taking it back to God and learning how to have a relationship with him. Because if I read the word and my practice is I'm going to read a chapter a day, I can just plow through the chapter. It may not soak in, and then I can add another practice that helps me soak in a little bit. I could soak in a verse of scripture for an hour. I may still not be abiding with God while I'm doing that. And so I think that's part of what God calls us to do, just like if we take it to the perspective of kids as they're growing up. Of course, I want the training wheels on the bike as they're learning that, and then I'm holding onto the back of their bike and then they can ride it themselves, but only in the driveway. I mean, it's very much that same model. And I think God is calling us further and further into less comfortable, but more dependent on him moment by moment. And the only way to do that is relationally with him.
Yeah, I think it changes the trust center is what I'm realizing. Like as I've been processing this, it changes the trust center from this checklist of I'm doing things so I feel comfortable and I feel good about what I'm doing to I feel comfortable and I know who I am. And that is to be in relationship, in community, in connection with who God is. As you were talking about that, like just studying the word, it reminds me, we're referencing Jamie a lot today.
We are.
When I read his book, he uses the example of like a letter that was given. And like we spend all these time studying the letter. Like he imagines he got a letter from his wife. I think it was the example he used. It's been a while since I read this book. So sorry, Jamie, if I...
The book is Friendship with God, if you're wondering.
There you go. He references a letter he got from his wife. And he walks through the analogy of like, oh, I was studying every single letter and circling where she used the same letter and like studying this and trying to discern the meaning of this. And all this time, like I have my wife right there.
Yeah.
Like,
right.
That's what it is. Like it's there to help paint a fuller picture and help connect. But the goal is not just to study the letter. The goal is to be in a relationship with.
Right.
And I thought that was a really helpful way of viewing it. I think the tendency is we can find ourselves on one of two extremes. One is like what we've been talking about of checking the list, accomplishing those rules. The other is even being afraid of the rules.
Yeah.
Josh McDowell has a great quote that rules without relationship lead to rebellion. And I think you can see both sides of that, with whether you're to the extreme of my rules and checklist is my safety, or I don't need any of those disciplines because I've got God. And the guys group that I'm leading, we're walking through Romans 6 and 7 this week, where it's talking about like, because of grace, what's our response?
Yeah.
And Paul is saying, by no means, like all these things are still necessary. All these things are still good.
Yeah.
But our motivation, we're no longer slaves that are incapable of doing that, but we want to be slaves to God, which is super contradictory and has a lot of stuff that we're not going to get into here. But at the same time, not contradictory, super controversial. There we go.
Okay.
Super controversial, not contradictory. But it's opening up so that we can have freedom and being in connection with God, because that is the ultimate freedom. And doing these things out of freedom instead of out of guilt or out of a checklist and thinking that we have to earn it.
Yeah.
So that.
Absolutely. I think there's if I flip the coin over, as I like to do, there's danger in what we're proposing. It seems very dangerous if we are not confident in who God is and who he made us to be.
Yeah.
Because we're trying a lot of times to find that comfort in those rules.
Yeah.
Or to escape what we perceive as a danger in the rules. If I do that, X might happen. And the reality is, if we know who God is and we know who we are in him, then we will long to be with him, both to understand his rules, his principles, and practices that he calls us to do, and abiding with him to know when he wants us doing those things and how.
Yep.
And I think for me, just to kind of tie all of it together, the practice that has helped me the most in this, practices really, a set of them is about abiding.
Yeah. To abide is human.
Yes, exactly. Putting it in our sentence. As I've been learning to abide with him, and that's soaking deeper into my life and my day, then the more I'm able to, in the moment, be able to be with him and ask him, instead of feeling like my hand is on that steering wheel and I'm going, I'm going to use this practice, I'm going to use this principle, I'm going to stick with this, instead of, Father, what are you up to? And what do you want me to know right now and be doing right now?
Yeah.
And I just want more and more of that soaking. And so there's some practices that help me with that, but I encourage myself to keep going further, and everybody as well, just to lean into that. Because what does God want? It's actually, to close out, it's the next verse of what we have that Jesus said in John 5, which is lovely, I think. Remember the words, the Son of God. This is Jesus talking about this. The next thing he said is, for the Father loves the Son and shows him all he does. We too, the Father loves us and wants to show us what he's doing, who he is, and invite us into that work.
Woo.
This is good stuff.
Yeah. Awesome. Great topic. Great exploration. Thanks for bringing that up, my friend.
Yeah. Been challenged by it. I'm glad to pass on the challenge.
Yeah. So to abide is human. Hey folks, thanks for tuning in today. Our team is made up of myself, Chris Conlin, and Mark Wavle, and our lead editor is Derek Donley. We're a crowd-funded nonprofit. Our free resources exist because of your generous support. To learn more about us or to check out classes that we talk about here, visit us at www.humanproject.us. Thanks for joining us on our mission to bring 1 million lives closer to the fullness of God's design.